good evening, and welcome back to Ghost Chronicles. Tonight, we don't concern ourselves with fairy tales or fiction. We journey to the old places, to the dark woods and forgotten ridges of the Appalachian mountains, where the very soil remembers things mankind has tried to forget. These are not just stories. They are echoes trapped in the hills. And tonight, they have found their way to you. So lower the lights, settle in, and listen closely to the sounds between the words. I need to confess, but I don't know if there's a priest alive who could understand the nature of my sin. Perhaps this isn't confession at all. Maybe it's a warning. The truth is, I have been haunted for more than 30 years, but I've only just now realized the ghost was never the true monster. I was, and my cowardice has doomed my own children. It all goes back to a small, unassuming house tucked away in a fold of the lower Appalachian range. My sister and I spent our childhoods there, in a world bordered by a sea of trees. Our parents worked the land, their hands calloused and their backs bent from coaxing life from the stubborn soil. We were left to our own devices, and our world was the dirt road, the creek, and the edge of the woods. That's where he was waiting. That's where we met Elijah. He wasn't from any family we knew. In a community that small, a new face was an event. But Elijah was simply there. One day he wasn't, and the next, he was a permanent fixture of the landscape. I remember him as the boy who lived in the woods, always half leaning against a gnarled oak or perched on a moss-covered log. He had a shock of hair that stood up as if he just touched lightning, and he wore the same pair of ratty overalls for months on end, caked with dirt that never seemed to wash away. He smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something acrid and sharp like old cigarette smoke. Though I never once saw him with a cigarette, he should have been an outcast. He was pale and wiry, with a gaunt look that suggested he was perpetually hungry. But there was a frightening intensity in his eyes, a depth that made you feel like he knew every secret you'd ever kept. Out of all the kids in our small, roaming pack, Elijah was the undisputed leader. He was a rebel, overflowing with a dark charisma. Nothing, and I mean nothing, made him happier than seeing someone get hurt. At first, his cruelty was disguised as harmless fun, the kind of roughhousing boys do. He'd stand by the worn trail near the creek and challenge us to a race to the top of an old stone wall. But just as you reached the peak, his hand would shoot out a firm shove to your chest or back. You'd tumble down the other side, scraping your knees on the rocks below, and his laughter would echo through the trees. It was a wild, unrestrained sound that made you want to laugh with him, even as your eyes watered from the pain. You did what Elijah wanted. You laughed when he laughed. You wanted him to like you, because the alternative was something you didn't dare consider. My relationship with my sister, which was already fragile, began to truly fracture during that time. Her name is Anna, and she was small for her age, with a sensitivity that Elijah seemed to sniff out like a predator. He was especially cruel to her. I remember one afternoon, she had a small porcelain doll named Clara, a gift from our grandmother. It was her most prized possession. Elijah snatched it from her hands, a wicked grin spreading across his face. He smeared its painted face with mud, then held it over the deep part of the creek, daring her to grab it. Her hand shot out desperate, and with a sharp twist, he snapped the doll's head clean off. It fell into the water and was gone. We all laughed. I laughed the loudest. I can still see the look of betrayal on her face, a wound far deeper than any scrape or bruise. In that moment, I chose him over her. I was terrified he would turn on me next. The distance she has kept from me my entire adult life. I know I earned every inch of it. Over time, Elijah's jokes escalated. They lost their thin veil of playfulness and became openly malicious. The incident that should have been the final straw was the fire. It was a cool autumn evening, and my father was inside with Anna, reading to her by the fire. I was in the yard, watching the shadows lengthen. I saw Elijah at the edge of the woods, holding something. He moved toward the back of the house, to a pile of dry firewood stacked against the wall. A few moments later, I saw a flicker of orange, then a plume of dark smoke. He had set fire to our house. Panic seized me, but it was drowned out by a more powerful, more selfish fear. I didn't scream. I didn't run for help. I just stood there, frozen, as the flames began to lick up the wooden siding. My father smelled the smoke and managed to get himself and Anna out, but not before a falling, burning piece which struck my sister's arm. She still carries a scar to this day, a pale, puckered mark on her forearm. When my parents, frantic and terrified, asked me what happened, I played dumb. I swore I had no idea. The lie felt like poison on my tongue, but I swallowed it down. After that, a profound sense of caution took root in me. I stopped going to the trail alone. I'd watch the woods from our porch, my chin tucked into my jacket, as if I could hold myself together by sheer force of will. Elijah still came by. He'd walk the perimeter of our property, just beyond the fence, calling my name in a sing-song voice as if nothing had happened. His presence was a constant, low-grade threat. One day, he led me into a part of the woods I'd never seen before, a small, perfectly circular clearing where the sunlight seemed unnaturally dim and no bird sang. The place felt wrong, oppressive. I told him I knew a cooler spot up ahead, a place with a rope swing. I just wanted to get away from that clearing. He was curious and followed me, but maybe 2 minutes into our walk, I glanced over my shoulder, and I was alone. Elijah was gone. My stomach plummeted. I wasn't allowed this deep in the woods by myself. I thought it was another one of his tricks, that he was hiding behind a tree, waiting to jump out. Tense and on edge, I started back the way I came. When I reached the edge of that strange, silent clearing, there he was. He was just sitting on the ground, his face a mask of misery. For the first time, I felt a pang of pity for him. I asked if he was okay. He didn't look at me. He just said he couldn't follow me. He said he couldn't go any farther from our house than that distance. I didn't understand what he meant and pushed him for an answer. He finally looked up, his eyes burning with an ancient frustration, and told me never to ask him about it again. I obeyed. Elijah started showing up less after that. The last time I ever saw him, I was 9. He shoved a younger boy off his bicycle on the road near our house. The boy fell hard, his leg broken at a sickening angle. In those days, the nearest hospital was a long drive, and a broken bone was a major crisis. The incident became a huge scandal in our small community. Because it happened so close to our property, my mother came straight to me, her face grim. I knew this was different. This wasn't just mean, it was dangerous. That night, trembling in the kitchen, I finally told her everything. Every cruel joke, every threat, the fire. For once, she truly listened. She didn't brush me off or tell me I was imagining things. I watched her talk quietly with my dad later that night. Their faces etched with fear I was only just beginning to comprehend. A few days later, a woman I didn't know came to our house. She was older, with sharp eyes and clothes that seemed to belong to another time. She didn't speak to me. She just walked the property, then burned several small, tightly wrapped bundles in a metal basin in the yard. I asked my mom what she was doing. She told me they were just old things with bugs in them, and it was better to get rid of them. I was 9, so I believed her. Then Elijah just stopped coming around. He was gone. I'd sometimes wander to the edge of the woods, half expecting him to step out from behind a tree, but he never did. I felt a strange sense of loss, because for all his cruelty, he had been my only real friend. But beneath the loss was profound, overwhelming relief. Years went on. My cowardice had carved a canyon between my sister and me. When we were teenagers, I tried to apologize, to explain. She just looked at me with cold, empty eyes and said it was too late, that I had never been a brother to her. She was right. We lost contact completely after we left home. My parents both passed away last year, just days apart. I saw Anna at the funeral. We stood on opposite sides of the grave, two strangers bound by blood and a shared, poisoned past. She told me to take the house. She wanted nothing to do with it. For almost a year, the house sat empty, a monument to my failures. Then, 2 months ago, I finally drove back, determined to clean it out and sell it, to finally close that chapter of my life. The basement was a crypt of forgotten memories, damp and smelling of earth. I thought it would be quick work. It wasn't. And that brings me to 3 days ago. I was in a far corner of the basement when I found a moldy cardboard box. Inside were photographs of the family who owned the property before my parents. I never knew much about them, only that my parents got the land for a song because no one else would touch it. As I sifted through the faded images, I saw him, a formal portrait of Elijah, propped up on pillows in a bed. He was sickly, gaunt, but his eyes held the same mean, knowing look I remembered so well. I went online and started digging through old county records, property deeds, obituaries. That's when I found the truth. Elijah had lived in that house, and he had died there, in a fire that consumed his bedroom when he was too sick to escape. For 2 days, I was in shock. The ghost of a cruel boy, bound to the place of his death. It was a terrifying story, but it was a story with an end. A story that stayed in those mountains. Yesterday, I went back to the basement to pack up that last box. As I lifted it, something slipped from the pocket of my own jacket and fluttered to the floor. A single, glossy photograph. I didn't recognize it. I hadn't put it there. I picked it up. My blood ran cold. It was a picture of my 2 children, my son and my daughter. They were in our backyard, laughing, bathed in the sunlight of a perfect summer afternoon. The picture was taken last week at my home, hundreds of miles from the Appalachians. I stared, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then I saw it. Standing just behind my daughter, his form faint and semi-transparent, was a pale boy with wild hair. His lips were pulled back in a familiar, hungry grin. The curse was never about the land. It was about me. And now, I brought him home to them. I am not exaggerating when I say the woods that surround our cabin are alive. Most people who choose to live this far out in the Appalachian mountains of West Virginia do so for the quiet. For us, it was never a choice. It was a retreat, a surrender. A year after my wife, Sarah, and I were married, I was diagnosed with leukemia. The world we had planned, the jobs, the house in the suburbs, the future, crumbled into a mountain of medical bills. We lost everything. This small, isolated cabin was the only thing that stood between us and the street. Despite the crushing weight of our circumstances, Sarah has a gift. She can find a sliver of light in the deepest darkness. She finds beauty in the rustle of leaves, joy in the sight of a deer at the woodline, and has pulled me from the depth of depression more times than I can count. She is the reason this isolation, forced upon us as it was, began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. We were finding a way to be happy. We were making it work. But that was before the whistling started. About a month ago, on the night of September 17th, our sanctuary was breached. Everything we had fought so hard to build began to unravel. It was around 10:30 p.m. We were in bed, the glow of my laptop screen casting long shadows across the room as we watched the show. That's when it came. Faint at first, just 3 soft notes stretched thin like a frayed nerve. It sounded like someone trying to call a dog from a great distance. I remember pausing the video, my finger hovering over the trackpad. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the window. We both held our breath, listening. It came again, a little louder this time, clearer, the same 3 slow, mournful notes, stripped of any rhythm or joy. At first, there was no reason to panic, just a sound. It could have been a neighbor calling for a lost pet, or perhaps a hunter moving through the woods late. It was odd, given our isolation, but not impossible. The locals, we'd learned, have a deep-seated reluctance to enter the woods after dark, an unspoken rule we'd quickly adopted. Still, a person was the most logical explanation. I got out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath my feet. I checked the front porch, then walked the perimeter of the yard with a heavy flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous path through the oppressive darkness. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the immense silence that followed. I saw no movement. I heard nothing more. I went back to bed, telling Sarah it was probably just the wind. She didn't look convinced. She has an intuition about these woods that I lack, a sensitivity that allows her to feel shifts in the atmosphere I can only guess at. The next night, it came again. Same time, same 3 notes. By the end of the week, the whistle was a nightly ritual. It would start around 10:30 and continue for hours, a relentless, disembodied presence. Sometimes it would drift closer, the sound so sharp it felt as if the person were standing right outside our bedroom window. even though our room is on the second floor with no balcony or roof access. I tried to maintain a calm facade, joking that we had a persistent prankster on our hands. But I could see the toll it was taking on Sarah. The sound was getting under her skin, and if I were being honest, it was crawling under mine, too. A week into this siege, something changed. The simple 3-note tune was gone. In its place was a new melody. It was a tune Sarah had been humming to herself earlier that afternoon while she was tending to her small garden. A simple, cheerful little song she'd made up. Hearing it now, whistled slowly and tunelessly from the darkness, was horrifying. I saw the blood drain from her face. This wasn't prankster. A prankster wouldn't know that tune. A prankster wouldn't be this patient, this personal. This was something else. This was something that was watching us. Listening, the fear began to fester. A few nights later, I had a severe panic attack. The stress, the lack of sleep, the constant, oppressive feeling of being watched. It all became too much. I woke up gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I was dying. Sarah held me, her own fear momentarily forgotten as she tried to calm me down, her voice a soothing anchor in my terror. It took nearly an hour for my breathing to return to normal. The following night, the whistle changed again. It was no longer a melody. It was a sound, a rhythmic, rasping, wheezing sound. I sat bolt upright in bed, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. It was the sound of my own panic breathing from the night before, perfectly mimicked and played back to us from the woods. It was a mockery of my most vulnerable moment. The entity wasn't just listening. It was learning. It was targeting our specific fears, weaponizing our own private moments against us. That's when the whistle moved inside. It was around 2 a.m. a few nights later. The house was pitch black, silent. I was woken by the sound again, but this time it wasn't coming from the woods or even from just outside the window. It was in the room with us. It was so close, so clear and sharp, that for a terrifying moment, I thought it was coming from inside my own head. Sarah whispered my name, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" I couldn't answer. I just stared at our closet door. The sound had come from the direction of the closet. It happened again. 3 long, slow notes whistled with a dry, chilling precision. The air in the room grew heavy and cold. It felt like a physical pressure was emanating from that dark space. We sat there, frozen in our bed, listening as the sound echoed from behind the closed door until it finally, mercifully, stopped. The next morning, I spent money we didn't have. I bought motion-activated cameras, floodlights, and spools of fishing line that I strung like a spiderweb across every conceivable path leading from the woods to our house. I was desperate for proof, for a face to put to the terror that was dismantling our lives. Every morning, I would check the footage, my hands shaking. And every morning, there was nothing. The fishing lines were untouched. The ground was undisturbed. The lights never triggered. Whatever this was, it left no trace. We were losing sleep. I could see Sarah falling apart, the light in her eyes dimming. She was exhausted, but it was more than that. It was as if her life force was being drained away by the nightly terror. I finally broke down and called the police. It felt absurd, trying to explain to a dispatcher that we were being harassed by a whistle, but she sent a car out. 2 officers arrived. One was young, restless. The other was an older man, his face a roadmap of long, hard years on the job. I told them everything, from the first night to the mimic breathing to the sound in the closet. The younger officer barely concealed a smirk, but the older one, he just stared at me. When I mentioned the date it all started, September 17th, I saw him flinch. His face went pale. He shared a look with his partner, a look that spoke volumes. He stepped closer and asked me a question, his voice low and serious. "The tune, does it ever change? Does it learn?" My blood ran cold. I nodded, telling him how I had mimicked my wife's humming and my breathing. The officer closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't offer an explanation. He just walked to the edge of our porch and scanned the tree line for a long time. Before they left, he turned back to me. "Lock your doors," he said, his voice heavy with an unspoken warning. "And don't answer them. Not for anything or anyone. That night, the whistle came back, louder and more defiant than ever. I sat on the edge of the bed, with a shotgun across my lap, my knuckles white. Sarah was buried under the covers, her breathing shallow. The whistle moved around the house, a slow, mocking patrol. And then, at some point before dawn, I looked out the window, and I saw it for the first time. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, a hole in the world, a patch of darkness in the yard so absolute that it seemed to absorb the faint moonlight around it. It was a walking void in the shape of a man. I stared, paralyzed, unable to process what I was seeing. As my eyes remained fixed on it, the void figure slowly raised a long, thin arm. It brought a hand-like appendage up to where a face should be. And then the whistle came again. But it wasn't a tune. It was a voice. It was Sarah's voice, perfectly replicated, whispering my name from a thing in the yard. David, it called. A sweet, inviting tone that was grotesquely out of place. Let me in. I stumbled back from the window, tripping over the rug and hitting the floor hard. I lied to Sarah, told her I just got spooked by a shadow. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't make that thing real for her. I've stopped checking the cameras. I know they won't show me anything. The entity, whatever it is playing a game on a level I can't comprehend. It's a predator that hunts with sound and fear. It learns. It knows our voices. And tonight, just an hour ago, I heard my wife whisper my name from the closet, even though she's been sleeping right next to me the whole time. Story 3, The Figure at the Glass. I've always hated Halloween. It's not the costumes or the candy, or even the manufactured scares. For me, the holiday is a scar, a reminder of something I saw when I was 9 years old. I grew up in a rural pocket of West Virginia, where, back then, whispers of cults and strange rituals in the woods were common. One Halloween, a neighbor kid, someone I used to play with, did something to a stray cat that I will not describe. The image of it, the casual cruelty, burned itself into my mind. Since then, October 31st has always felt ugly, tainted with a real darkness that store-bought skeletons can't replicate. This is why, last year, I was relieved to be house-sitting for my parents. They had driven down to visit my aunt in South Carolina for their annual trip, leaving me in charge of their home. While the city where I live erupts into a frenzy of parties and trick-or-treaters, my parents' house is an island of silence. It's an old 2-story farmhouse on the edge of a dense national forest, a 20-minute drive from the nearest town. No close neighbors, no streetlights. Just the house, the trees, and a quiet that feels heavy enough to suffocate you. My parents loved the solitude. I always found unnerving. But for that one night, I craved it. I spent most of the evening in the living room, the TV on for background noise, scrolling aimlessly on my phone. The house was a fortress against the holiday I despised. By 8 p.m., however, I noticed the quality of the silence outside had changed. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead. The ceaseless chirping of the crickets had stopped. The rustle of unseen things in the underbrush was gone. It was a vacuum of sound, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I've since read countless accounts from people in this region who describe the same phenomenon. The world going unnaturally still right before something terrible happens. They say it's the animals sensing a predator nearby. I believe them. At 10:17 p.m., the security system let out a single, sharp beep. A notification flashed on the control panel. Rear motion sensor triggered. My parents' cameras were old, but they worked. I pulled up the feed for the back of the property on my phone. Nothing. Just an impenetrable wall of darkness beyond the faint outline of the tree line. Annoyed, I stepped outside onto the back porch to check the sensor itself. The cold air bit at my skin, my breath pluming in the dim light. There was no wind, no sound, no sign of anything that could have triggered the alarm. I reset the panel and went back inside, locking the door behind me, a new thread of anxiety weaving itself into evening. Around 11:30, I heard it, a high-pitched, piercing whistle. It came from the direction of the woods, sharp and clean. It was far too deliberate to be the wind or an animal. A part of my mind, desperate for a rational explanation, wondered if it was someone trying to get my attention. The thick, Climbing ivy that grew over the front porch almost completely obscured the doorbell. Maybe someone was lost. Against my better judgment, I walked to the front door and opened it. The porch light spilled out across the dirt driveway and the front fence, illuminating a patch of silent, watching trees. "Is anyone there?" I called out. My voice was swallowed by the void. No one answered. I told myself it was just some teenagers, drunk and looking for trouble. But the whistle had crawled under my skin, a cold splinter of dread. I locked the door, checked it twice, and retreated back to the relative safety of the living room. 10 minutes later, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I turned the corner from the hallway, my heart stopped. Standing just outside the sliding glass door that led to the backyard was a figure. It was impossibly tall, its head nearly touching the top of the door frame. Its body was a study in wrong proportions. The limbs were too long, the torso too thin, like a human form stretched on a rack. It was dressed in something that looked like black fabric, but it didn't fold or wrinkle. It clung to the creature's emaciated frame like a second skin. But the face that was the source of the true horror, there was no mask. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless, black surface like polished obsidian. And set within that void were its eyes. They weren't eyes in any biological sense. They were two narrow, horizontal slits of brilliant, sickening, yellow light. They glowed with their own internal fire, like the predatory eyes of a nocturnal reptile. And they were locked directly on me. This was not a costume. This was not a prank. This was something that did not belong in our world. A primal, paralyzing fear unlike anything I had ever known washed over me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I could only stare as those burning yellow eyes held me pinned in place. My mind fractured. For a split second, I thought of my dad's handgun in the safe in his bedroom. I tore myself from the hypnotic gaze and bolted down the hall. My hands fumbled with the combination, the numbers feeling alien under my trembling fingers. I finally got the safe open, grabbed a heavy pistol, and ran back to the kitchen, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It was gone. Beyond the glass door, there was only the vast, endless darkness of the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours until dawn pacing the house, the cold weight of the gun in my hand a pathetic comfort. I checked the locks on every door and window, again and again. Every creak of the old house was the creature returning. Every shadow was its form coalescing in the darkness. But what replayed in my mind on a constant, torturous loop were those eyes, those impossible, burning yellow eyes. In the clear, rational light of morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by stress and my deep-seated aversion to the holiday. I walked the entire perimeter of the property, searching for any sign, any proof. There were no footprints in the soft dirt of the backyard, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if it had never been there. The lack of evidence was almost more terrifying than the encounter itself. I made a decision. I would not tell my parents. They loved this house. It was their sanctuary. Telling them I had seen some 7-foot-tall monster with glowing eyes outside their kitchen would only poison their peace, especially with no proof to back it up. I convinced myself it was a one-time event, a Halloween madness that had come and gone. For a year, I almost believed it. Life returned to normal. My parents came home, and their house was once again just a house. The incident became a bad memory, something I could quarantine in the back of my mind. But the past doesn't stay buried in these mountains. Halloween is approaching again, and things have started happening at the house. My parents have been complaining for weeks about the security system, the same one that had been triggered that night. Alarms going off in the dead of night, always after 3 a.m. motion sensors trip with nothing on the cameras. They've had the company out twice. The technicians found nothing wrong. They called the police, a rare act for them, but the patrols found no signs of prowlers. My parents are exhausted, on edge, their sanctuary slowly turning into a source of anxiety. My dad called me today. He sounded tired and frustrated. He told me he'd had enough of the old system and had installed a brand new set of high-definition security cameras himself. He said the new system was top of the line. But his voice dropped when he told me what happened last night. He said that every night, around 3 a.m., the feed from the camera covering the backyard cuts out, just for a second. But just before it does, he said he can just make out something on the edge of the frame. Something tall, with what he thinks are yellow eyes. Story 4. I have this ritual. Some might call it reckless. Others might call it a form of therapy. Every Halloween, I go out into the mountains alone. I pack minimal gear, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, some water, and I hike to one of the old, abandoned fire lookout towers at the high ridges of the southern Appalachians. The goal is complete isolation. No phone signal, no other campers. Just me, the wind, and whatever the night decides to share. It started years ago as a way to confront my own anxieties, to get comfortable with the feeling of being small and vulnerable in a vast, indifferent wilderness. Each trip has had its share of oddities. Strange sounds on the wind, shadows that move when they shouldn't, nights where the silence feels like a physical presence. But I've never been truly, deeply rattled. Not until last year. I'm not a person who subscribes to the supernatural. I'm a skeptic at heart. I appreciate the folklore of these mountains, the strange tales of spectral creatures, and ancient warnings that cling to these hills like morning fog. I read about them, I find them fascinating, but I've always viewed them as just that, stories, ways for people to explain the unexplainable. I never believed any of it was real. Last Halloween, I chose a spot I'd only read about, a fire watch tower perched high on a remote, wind-swept ridge. These towers are relics from the mid-20th century, skeletal structures of steel with a small cabin at the very top, offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. The hike up was grueling. The last few miles a series of steep, rough switchbacks. I reached the tower just before sunset, dropped my pack in the small, glass-enclosed cabin at the top, and took a moment to absorb the view. The ridges rolled away in every direction, fading into shades of blue and purple as the sun bled out below the horizon. The forest below was a dark, silent ocean. I set up my sleeping bag on the dusty wooden floor of the cabin, then climbed back down the rickety stairs to build a small fire in the designated metal ring outside. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the deepening twilight, its warmth a welcome defense against the sharp, cold air. As I cooked my simple dinner, I felt a familiar sense of peace settle over me. This is why I did this. The solitude, the raw beauty, the feeling of being utterly removed from the noise of the world. After eating, I went back up to the cabin. A week before the trip, I had done some research into the local lore of this specific region. I'd printed out a few articles about a particular legend, the black dog of the ridge. According to the stories, a massive, spectral black dog is sometimes seen on high ridgelines and lonely forest roads. Its appearance is almost always interpreted as an omen, a warning of imminent misfortune or death. The details varied wildly from one account to the next, which only reinforced my skepticism. It was just a classic ghost story. But reading about it, alone in a fire tower on Halloween night, seemed fitting. Around 10 p.m., I made my final preparations of the night. I checked that the fire outside had burned down to embers, climbed the stairs one last time, and locked the heavy metal door of the cabin from the inside. The wind was picking up, whistling through the steel supports of the tower, a mournful, soothing sound. I crawled into my sleeping bag, and the rhythmic howl of the wind quickly carried me off to sleep. I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. The cabin was pitch black. A profound silence had fallen. Even the wind had died down. It was the absence of sound that had woken me. I lay there, every sense on high alert, trying to identify what was wrong. And then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It was coming from below. It sounded like heavy footsteps on the metal stairs of the tower. My heart began to pound. My first thought was that another hiker had arrived, seeking shelter for the night. These lookouts are first come, first served. But who would be hiking up here in the middle of the night without a headlamp? The sound was slow, deliberate, and it was getting closer. A primal fear, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the back of my neck. I thought about shouting down, telling whoever was at the tower was occupied. But something kept my voice locked in my throat. The thumping stopped. Silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard a new sound. A scratching. Scrape. Scrape. It was the sound of claws on the metal catwalk just outside the cabin door. My skepticism evaporated in an instant, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The legend, the black dog, it was real, and it was right outside my door. The stories had said it was an omen of death. I assumed it was the agent of that death, that it had come for me. Slowly, I crept toward the door. I peered through a small, grimy pane of glass set into the metal. I couldn't see anything in the oppressive darkness, but I could feel it, a pressure, a weight in the air. Then, the scratching started again, more frantic this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It wanted in. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, I scrambled across the small cabin, grabbing a heavy wooden chair and jamming it under the door handle. I retreated to the far corner, pulling my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible. All night long, I listened to the sounds of the creature outside. The constant, desperate scratching at the door. The heavy, pacing footsteps on the metal balcony. The low, angry growls. It circled the cabin for hours, a relentless, predatory presence, testing the walls, the windows, the door, searching for a way in. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own sanctuary, convinced that I was going to die on that mountain. Just as the first hint of gray light began to appear on the eastern horizon, the sound stopped, the scratching ceased, the pacing ended. An unnerving silence fell over the tower once more. I stayed in my corner for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any sign of the creature. Nothing. It was gone. A wave of relief so powerful, almost made me sick, washed over me. I had survived. Shakily, I got to my feet and unjammed the chair from the door. I had to see. I had to have proof. I took a deep breath, unlocked the bolt, and slowly pulled the heavy door inward. The balcony was empty. The dog was gone. The rising sun was beginning to cast a warm, golden light over the ridges. It was over, but as I stepped out onto the catwalk, my eyes fell upon the floor. The metal was deeply gouged, covered in scratches, and there, etched into the steel with what must have been incredible force, were 3 words. Don't look down. A cold dread, far worse than the fear I had felt during the night, seized me. I didn't understand. A warning? Confused, and with my heart beginning to hammer my chest again, I couldn't stop myself. I walked to the railing and peered over the edge. Standing at the base of the tower, half hidden in the long shadows cast by the rising sun, was a figure. It was unnaturally tall and thin, dressed in something black that seemed to absorb the morning light. It was looking up at me, and even from that distance, I could see its eyes. They were 2 narrow slits of burning, malevolent yellow. It had been waiting there all night. The dog wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to keep me in. It was protecting me. And I just showed the thing at the bottom of the stairs that I was finally alone. Story 5. The Wounded Mountain. I have spent most of my adult life trying to forget the autumn of 2001, but memory is a stubborn thing. Every October, when the air turns sharp and carries the scent of wood smoke and decay, I am pulled back to that small cabin my family owned, high in the folded peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. It was a place my father built with his own hands, a place he believed was a refuge from the artificial cruelties of the world. He thought the silence of the forest would cleanse us. He was wrong. Some places are not meant to hold families. Some places are hungry, and our mistake was thinking nature was ever gentle. I have written this story down so many times in private journals that the words feel worn, polished smooth like river stones. It's a defense mechanism, I think. If I focus on the perfect sentence, on the precise shade of the turning leaves, perhaps I can keep the true horror of what happened at bay. Perhaps I can pretend it's just a story. I remember the winding road that led to the cabin, the tires crunching over gravel as we climbed higher and higher, the sky thinning until it felt brittle. And I remember my brother, Eli, sitting beside me in the back seat. He was my twin. We shared a face, a room, a life. But on that trip, he was different. He stared out the window at the passing tree line with a strange, unnerving stillness, as if he were recognizing a place he'd only ever seen in his dreams. It was our last trip to the cabin together. Perhaps that's why every detail is burned into my mind, a photograph I can't bear to look at, but can never throw away. The cabin itself seemed to sag under the weight of the years, its wooden bones swollen with rain and neglect. The air inside was thick with the smell of old pine, wood ash, and something else, a faint, cloyingly sweet scent, like overripe fruit, that clung to our clothes long after we left. The first night, the forest was utterly silent. No wind, no insects, just an enormous, pressing quiet that pushed against the window panes. It felt as if the whole mountain was holding its breath, waiting. Eli was restless that evening. He walked the perimeter of the cabin again and again, his small feet tracing a path in the dirt, as if he were mapping something invisible. My parents, caught up in the familiar rituals of arrival, paid him little mind, but I saw the look in his eyes. It was an unfocused calm, a detached serenity, as if he were listening to a conversation happening in a room deep beneath the earth. He was already somewhere else. That night, I read him stories from an old book we kept at the cabin, tales of the mountain and the strange things that lived there. I had hoped they would soothe him, but instead, they seemed to only deepen his strange trance. He grew calm, yes, but it was a calm of acceptance, and it terrified me. The next day passed in a haze of forced family normalcy. My father chopped wood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe a fragile defense against the oppressive silence. My mother whistled tunelessly as she unpacked groceries. But beneath these ordinary gestures, a quiet dissonance hummed, a sense that we were being watched by something patient, ancient, and unseen. That night, something happened that I would later convince myself was only a dream. I woke in the dead of night to a cold so profound it felt as if it were seeping out of the very walls. My eyes adjusted to darkness, and I saw Eli. He was standing at the window, his small frame silhouetted against the glass. He was staring at something outside. I could see its shape, a tall, shadowy form moving with a strange, disjointed gait among the trees. I never saw its face. A wave of terror so pure washed over me that my mind simply shut it down, filing the image away as a nightmare. The next morning, I didn't ask him about it. I was too afraid of the answer. When we returned home from that trip, the silence of the mountain came with us. It was lodged deep under our skin, a seed of coldness that began to grow. Eli was the first to change. He started waking in the middle of the night, not from nightmares, but with a quiet purpose. He would stand at his bedroom window for hours, his breath fogging the glass, staring north, as if he could see the mountains from our suburban home. He grew thinner, paler, but it was a stillness that was most unnerving. It was as if he were trying to erase himself, to dissolve into the same empty quiet that filled the cabin. My parents whispered about stress, about the strange anxieties of growing up. They took him to doctors who offered diagnoses like childhood depression and anxiety disorders. But I knew that whatever had touched him in those woods was now living inside him. It was wearing him like a coat. Weeks later, he started scratching at the windows, not with his fingernails, but with a small, sharp stone he kept hidden in his pocket. He would etch strange, spiral patterns into the glass, patterns that looked like the rings of an ancient tree. And he began to whisper. At night, I would hear him from his bed, a low, guttural murmur in a language that was not human. It was a language of clicks and rocks and the shifting of deep earth. He stopped eating regular food, but he didn't lose weight. My mother would find him in the yard at dawn, his mouth stained with dirt, chewing on soil and small stones as if they were a delicacy. Then he vanished. It wasn't a sudden, frantic disappearance. It felt more like an inevitability, as if he had been slowly fading away one layer at a time, and his physical absence was simply the final step. My parents found the front door wide open, a trail of small, bare footprints leading from the house, across the lawn, and toward the river that bordered our property. And then nothing. The search lasted for 6 agonizing days. Our house was filled with the grim faces of police officers and volunteers, the smell of damp dogs and diesel fuel. I remember the hollow, desperate sound of my mother's voice as she called his name into the woods, a name that I knew no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the trees now. We were twins. People talk about a psychic connection, a bond that transcends words. I don't know what it was, But I felt it. I knew he hadn't been taken. He had been called. And he had answered. I knew he was facing something I couldn't interfere with. Something that had reached out to him in the forest and was now collecting its prize. When they finally found him, he was less than a mile from home, sitting calmly by the creek. He was barefoot, but his feet were clean. His clothes were dry, despite a heavy rain the night before. His expression was one of serene emptiness, as if he had just returned from a pleasant walk. He was never the same after that. The doctors called it a fugue state, a product of trauma. They said he was unharmed. They were wrong. For a while, we tried to pretend. We tried to fold ourselves back into the shape of a normal family. But there are certain silences that grow like black mold, certain truths that fester in the glances between people who refuse to speak them aloud. Eli was a shell. The whispers at night continued, but now they were clearer. The scratching on the windows became more frantic. He was no longer just a vessel. He was a cage, and the thing inside him was growing restless. He is in a psychiatric hospital now. He has been for many years. He sits in a chair in a white room, staring at a blank wall, completely catatonic. The official diagnosis is a severe, unresponsive form of schizophrenia. They say he is a danger to himself and others. They say he is insane. Last week, I went to visit him. It was the anniversary of his disappearance. I sat with him in that sterile room for an hour, talking to the empty shell of the boy who was once my brother. As I got up to leave, I put my hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, Eli," I whispered. "I'm so sorry for what happened." I turned and walked to the door. As I reached for the handle, a voice spoke from behind me. It was not Eli's voice. It was a dry, rasping sound, like stones grinding together. A voice that was ancient and cold and utterly devoid of human emotion. From the unmoving form of my brother, it said, "He accepts your apology. My mother says Eli is a danger to us. I know the truth. He's not the danger. He's the cage." Story 6. The Mimic at the Door. My husband and I live a life split between two worlds. We have a small apartment in Charleston, West Virginia, a foothold in the predictable rhythm of city life. But our hearts belong to a house nestled deep in the woods, a place I inherited after my parents passed away far too young. For a long time, we debated selling it. It's isolated, old, and full of memories that are both comforting and painful. But we always shared a fantasy of living somewhere remote, surrounded by the quiet hum of the forest. So we began restoring it, and now we spend long stretches of time there, letting the silence of the mountains seep into our bones. When I say the house is isolated, I mean it. We have two neighbors, but each is a 3-minute drive down a winding dirt road. Out here, you are on your own. Despite the solitude, nothing truly strange had ever happened there. My husband, Mark, and I are deeply respectful of the woods. We've read the stories. We've listened to the whispers from the old-timers in the nearest town. We understand that we are guests here, intruders in a world that is far older and more powerful than we are. We never go out after dark. We never take anything from the forest that isn't offered. We never disrespect the land. Perhaps that is why it had always left us in peace. Until 2 weeks ago. For the first time, I stayed in that house alone. A small but violent storm had rolled through the region, knocking out power lines across several counties. Mark is a lineman. He gets called out at all hours, often on short notice. When the call came, my first instinct was to pack a bag and drive back to the security of our apartment in Charleston. But the job was supposed to be quick, just a couple of days. And I had grown to feel comfortable in that house, to see it as my own. So I told him I would be fine. I decided to stay. The first day was entirely normal. I'll admit, as evening fell, the familiar house began to feel different. It felt too big for one person. The woods, usually a comforting presence, now seemed oppressive, their darkness pressing in against the windows. I drew the curtains, turned on every light downstairs, and tried to distract myself with a movie. The volume turned up just a little too loud. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with the distinct feeling that Mark was calling my name. It wasn't a dream. I am a notoriously heavy sleeper. A simple sound doesn't wake me. This was different. It was a feeling, an insistent pull, as if his voice had reached directly into my subconscious. The room was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing, but I could feel the immense, silent weight of the forest outside. I was spooked, but the thought of getting out of bed, of walking through that dark, empty house, was more terrifying than whatever I had imagined. I pulled the sheets up over my head, a childish but deeply ingrained instinct, and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, the fear had evaporated with the night. The sun streamed through the windows, and the house felt warm and safe again. I convinced myself it had just been a vivid dream, my mind playing tricks on me in the unfamiliar solitude. The day passed uneventfully. I answered a few work emails, and then, looking for a distraction, I went up to the attic to sort through boxes of my parents' old things. I lost track of time, and by the time I came back downstairs, it was already past 7:30 p.m. I heated up some leftovers and settled onto the couch with a book. The house was so quiet and cozy that I must have dozed off. I woke with a start, the book on my chest, the room dark except for a single lamp. It was 1:30 in the morning. I trudged upstairs, exhausted, and went into the bathroom to get ready for bed. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. A voice from outside. My husband's voice. Calling my name. Sarah? Honey, can you let me in? I froze, toothbrush halfway in my mouth. That was impossible. He wasn't supposed to be back until the next night at the earliest. If he had come home early, he would have called, and besides, he had a key. Why would he be asking me to let him in? My heart began to race. I crept into our bedroom, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and peered out the window. And there he was. It was him, standing in the driveway, bathed in the cold blue light of the moon. It was Mark's face, his build, his jacket. I opened the window just a crack. Mark? What's going on? I thought you weren't coming back until tomorrow. They finished early, he called up, his voice a perfect imitation of my husband's. But something was wrong. There was no warmth in it. It was flat, hollow, like a recording. My keys must have fallen out of my pocket somewhere on the job. Just let me in. I'm freezing out here. It was his voice, but the way he said it wasn't him. Every instinct in my body was screaming. Still, it looked exactly like my husband. I shut the window, my mind a whirl in confusion and fear. I started for the bedroom door, my feet carrying me toward the stairs. But something stopped me, a cold, primal dread that had nothing to do with logic. I walked back to the window, staying in the shadows, and peeked out again. The thing that looked like my husband was standing perfectly still, and then its head twitched. A single, sharp, violent jerk to the right. It was a completely unnatural movement, bird-like and insectoid. It happened again, and a third time. Then its expression shifted. The look of patient pleading on its face dissolved into one of cold, reptilian impatience. It looked straight up at my window, directly at where I was hiding. Its eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dark. My whole body went cold. I knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that was not my husband. I backed away from the window, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle a scream. I sat on the floor, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. How could it not be him? The face was the same. The voice was the same. But the movements, the eyes, they were wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. It took several minutes for me to calm down enough to reach for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. I called Mark. I didn't think he would answer. His service was always spotty on these remote jobs. But he'd picked up on the second ring. "Hey, honey, is everything okay?" he asked, his real voice warm and familiar, a stark contrast to the hollow mimicry from outside. My voice trembled as I asked, "Where are you?" "Still out on the line," he said. "We're not even close to done." "Why? What's wrong?" His words made my stomach drop. "Nothing." I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just had a weird feeling. Wanted to hear your voice." I knew if I told him what was happening, he would drop everything and rush home, potentially losing his job or getting into an accident on the dark mountain roads. I hung up and looked out the window again. The driveway was empty. It was gone. I checked the windows in the other rooms, my heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. I couldn't see it anywhere. Then, as I started to walk back downstairs, I froze halfway down the steps. I could see into the kitchen from my vantage point, and there, pressed against the glass of the kitchen window, was its shadow, the silhouette of my husband. A chill so profound it felt like ice in my veins shot through me. I almost fainted. I scrambled back up the stairs and locked myself in the bathroom, dragging a heavy set of drawers in front of the door. For the rest of the night, I heard it, circling the house, calling my name, begging to be let in. The voice was filled with a desperate, pleading sorrow that was almost convincing. But I knew what I had seen. I thank God I hadn't opened that door. When morning finally came, I crept out of the bathroom. The house was silent. The woods were calm and beautiful again. When my husband came home that night, I told him everything. We packed a bag and drove back to Charleston in stunned silence. It's been 2 weeks. We haven't been back. Mark thinks it was a man, a drifter with bad intentions who somehow knew his name and was trying to trick me. He says my panic and fear filled an arrest, that I built a story that wasn't real. Maybe he just can't face the idea that there are things out here that we don't understand. I don't blame him. Until 2 weeks ago, I didn't believe it either. He apologized for worrying me and promised he'd never leave me alone in that house again. But last night, I woke up and saw him standing at the foot of our bed, just watching me sleep in the dark. He didn't blink. Not once. Story 7, The Misplaced Trail. There's a critical difference between being lost and being misplaced. When you're lost, you're aware of your predicament. There's a frantic search for a landmark, a desperate consultation of a map. Some part of you is still fighting to find your way back. But when you're misplaced, you don't even realize it happening. The world around you subtly rearranges itself, shifting its form one tree, one stone at a time, until the place you're in looks almost like the place you started, but feels fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. That's what the mountains did to me. Or maybe to us. I'm still not sure. There were just 2 of us on that trip, me and Rachel. We had planned it for months, a long weekend hiking a quiet, southern stretch of the Appalachian Trail. It was the off-season, and the idea was to find a place where we could breathe air that hadn't touched concrete in a long time. I was burned out from a soul-crushing job. Rachel was recovering from a relationship that had taken far too much from her. We needed to disconnect. We packed light, stuck to the essentials, and made a pact. For the first 2 days, no talk of anything heavier than the weather. The first day was perfect. A cold, crisp morning gave way to a bright afternoon. The trail wound through ridges that caught the sunlight in slants, illuminating patches of brilliant green moss. We hiked until our legs ached with a satisfying burn, then found a flat spot near a gurgling stream to set up camp. The quiet was a balm. No distant traffic, no hum of power lines, just a whisper of the wind and the gentle rush of water. That night, we made instant noodles over a small stove, shared a flask of whiskey, and fell asleep to the sound of the stream, a lullaby we'd both forgotten existed. It was the next afternoon when things began to shift. It wasn't one single, obvious event. It was a collection of small, dissonant details. The air felt heavier, more humid, despite the clear sky. The trees, the same oaks and pines we've been walking past all day, seemed different, taller, perhaps. Their branches more tangled, their bark darker. Rachel laughed when I mentioned it. "You're just tired," she said, her voice light. "Your brain is making patterns out of nothing." She was probably right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were changing around us. As the day wore on, I started to notice something else. The silence. The vibrant chorus of the forest had faded away. The birds were gone. The insects were gone. Even the rustle of squirrels in the underbrush had ceased. It was as if someone had thrown a thick, soundproof blanket over the entire landscape. The only sound was the crunch of our own boots on the dry leaves, a noise that felt jarring and intrusive. When we stopped to make camp that evening, I couldn't shake the unnerving sense that we were not welcome. It was a low, persistent hum of anxiety in the back of my mind, a feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. "It's the woods," Rachel said, her cheerfulness sounding a little forced this time. "They're just playing tricks on you." But she didn't meet my eyes. She seemed to be trying to convince herself as much as me. We both fell asleep early, a silent, mutual agreement to pretend that everything was fine. I woke up deep in the night. It wasn't a sound that woke me, but a feeling, a gentle but firm nudge from the world outside the tent, a summons. I lay there for a long time, my eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to the silence so absolute it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. And then I saw the light. A pale, dim, sickly green glow was filtering through the tent fabric. It wasn't the moon. It wasn't a fire. It was steady and colorless and wrong. Holding my breath, I counted my own frantic heartbeats, then slowly, carefully, unzipped the tent fly just enough to peer out. There was nothing there, just the trees. But they weren't the same trees. Their trunks seemed closer together now, bent inward at a slight, unnatural angle, as if the forest had curled in on itself while we slept. The pale glow hovered in the distance between the trunks, a mist that did not move or dissipate. I blinked hard, and the trees looked normal again, but the glow remained for a few moments longer before finally fading into the blackness. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, shivering, and told myself I'd been dreaming. In the morning, Rachel said she'd slept like a log. I didn't mention what I'd seen. We packed up our camp and continued north along the trail, but the path itself felt alien. There were turns we didn't remember, familiar markers that were simply gone. We must have taken a wrong turn. Yesterday, Rachel said dismissively, but I had memorized a map. I knew every bend and landmark of that route. This wasn't it. The trail was actively rearranging itself around us. By that afternoon, a new element was added to the psychological assault. I started to hear a sound. It was soft, almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere far off in the woods to our right. It was a sound of someone dragging a heavy stick through dry leaves in slow, deliberate circles. S-H-H-H-H-H. 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 The most disturbing part was that it stopped every time I stopped walking. The moment I paused to listen, the sound would cease. The moment I started walking again, it would resume. I don't hear anything, Rachel insisted, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. It's just the wind and the leaves. The wind doesn't follow your pace, Rachel, I said, my voice tight with fear. The wind doesn't stop when you hold your breath. She just shook her head and walked faster. That night was hell. I couldn't sleep. The dragging sound was closer, a steady, circular scraping just beyond the tree line. I lay there, rigid with fear, trying not to breathe too loudly. At some point, I sat up through the mesh of the tent. I saw it again, that same pale, sickly green light flickering between the trees. It was closer this time. I didn't wake Rachel. I didn't want to see the detached sympathy in her eyes again. I just stared at the light until it finally went out. The next morning, I found them just behind our campsite, pressed deep into the damp earth, were footprints. They were bare, and they were small, almost childlike. They led from the edge of our camp and disappeared into the woods in the direction of the scraping sound and the light. They were probably here before we arrived, Rachel said, barely glancing at them. She shouldered her pack and started walking down the trail without waiting for me. I wanted to follow them, to know what had been watching us. But her coldness, her utter refusal to acknowledge that something was wrong, was more unnerving than the footprints themselves. I hurried to catch up. We made it back to the trailhead late the next evening, exhausted, filthy, and barely speaking. The drive home was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. Rachel gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't bring up what happened, and neither did I. As she pulled up in front of my apartment, I finally broke. You heard it too, didn't you? The dragging sound, and the footprints, you saw them. She turned off the car and looked at me. The person in the driver's seat looked like Rachel, but the expression on her face was one I had never seen before. It was cold, ancient, and filled with a faint, mocking amusement. She finally looked at me, a cold little smile on her face. You were right, she said, her voice a perfect, chilling imitation of Rachel's. The wind doesn't follow your pace. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving me standing on the sidewalk. I haven't heard from her since. But sometimes I get a call from her number. When I answer, there's no one there. Just the faint, familiar sound of a stick dragging through leaves. Story 8. I bought the property for a song. That should have been the first sign. In this part of the Appalachians, land is a legacy, passed down through generations until it's practically part of family's DNA. You don't just sell 100 acres of old-growth forest and a dilapidated farmhouse for next to nothing. But the owner, a man from a city I'd never heard of, was desperate to be rid of it. He'd inherited it from a great uncle he'd never met and wanted it gone, sight unseen. I was a city man myself, tired of the concrete and the noise, and I saw a bargain. I saw a sanctuary. I was a fool. The farmhouse was in worse shape than the picture suggested. The roof sagged, windows were broken, and the whole place had the damp, sweet smell of decay. I spent the first few weeks just making it habitable, patching holes, clearing out nests, and hauling away mountains of trash left behind by decades of neglect. The previous owner hadn't just lived here. He had been a hoarder, a man who couldn't let anything go. The house was a tomb of forgotten things. I found the music box in the attic. It was a space I had been dreading. The air up there was thick and hot, choked with dust and the smell of sun-baked pine and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood. The attic was crammed from floor to ceiling with junk. Stacks of yellowed newspapers, moth-eaten clothes, furniture shrouded in dusty white sheets like a congregation of ghosts. The box was tucked away in a far corner, sitting atop a small, three-legged table, as if it had been deliberately placed on display. It was hand-carved from a dark, almost black wood I didn't recognize. The craftsmanship was exquisite, intricate patterns of vines and thorns swirling across its surface. There was no keyhole, no visible latch. It looked ancient, a relic from another century. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cool wood. It felt heavy, heavier than it should have. Curiosity got the better of me. I lifted the lid. There was no tiny ballerina, no mirrored interior. The inside was lined with faded, wine-red velvet, and in the center was a simple brass cylinder dotted with tiny pins. As the lid opened, the mechanism whirred to life, and a melody began to play. It was the most unsettling tune I have ever heard. It wasn't just off-key, it was fundamentally discordant. The notes seemed to clash with each other in a way that was mathematically wrong, creating a sound that set my teeth on edge and sent a wave of nausea through my stomach. It was a melody of pure anxiety, a nursery rhyme composed in a nightmare. It lasted to perhaps 30 seconds, then wound down with a final, sour note that seemed to hang in the thick, dusty air for a long moment before fading. I quickly shut the lid, a strange feeling of violation washing over me, as if the sound had trespassed somewhere deep inside my head. I dismissed it as an old, broken toy, a curiosity. I took it downstairs and tossed it into a large trash bag with a pile of other junk I planned to haul to the dump. That night, I was woken by a sound. It was a faint, tinny sound of a music box. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The house was pitch black. I strained my ears, telling myself it was just the old house settling. My mind playing tricks on me after a long day of unsettling work. The sound didn't come again. I eventually fell back into a restless sleep, the memory of that discordant tune echoing in my dreams. The next morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when I saw it. The music box was sitting on the center of the kitchen table. I stared at it, my blood running cold. That was impossible. I had put it in the trash bag myself. The bag was still by the back door, waiting to be taken out. Had I taken it out without realizing? Was I that tired? I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, but a deep, primal part of my brain knew this was wrong. I grabbed the box, a feeling of revulsion making my skin crawl. This time, I didn't put it in the trash. I walked out to my truck, drove 10 miles down the winding mountain road, and threw it into a public dumpster behind a gas station. I watched the sanitation truck empty, that dumpster the next morning. I saw it get crushed and hauled away. 2 days later, I found a music box sitting on the pillow next to mine. When I woke up, there was no sign of a break-in. Every door and window was locked, just as I had left them. The box was pristine, not a scratch on it. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a mistake. The box had come back. It had come home. That night, the music started on its own. It was 3:13 a.m. I was jolted from sleep by that same sickeningly sweet, discordant melody. It was coming from the living room downstairs. I lay in my bed, paralyzed by fear, listening as the tune played its full, agonizing 30-second cycle, then fell silent. The silence that followed was somehow worse, thick with anticipation. And then I heard a new sound, a whisper. It came from the woods outside my window. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, a dry, rustling sound like leaves skittering across pavement. It sounded like a word, but a word in no language I knew. Every night for a week, the pattern repeated. The music box would play at the exact same time, from a different room in the house. One night, it was the kitchen. The next, the hallway. The next, the bathroom. And each time the music played, the whispers from the woods grew louder, closer, more distinct. It was no longer a single whisper, but many, a chorus of dry, hungry voices, all murmuring that same unintelligible word, over and over. They were just beyond the tree-line, waiting. The music was calling them. I tried everything. I tried burying the box in the woods, a mile from the house. It was on my doorstep the next morning. I tried sealing it in a container and sinking it in the deepest part of the local creek. It was sitting at the foot of my bed, dripping water onto the floorboards. When I woke up, the box could not be discarded. It could not be contained. It was a part of the house now. Or perhaps the house was a part of it. After 2 weeks of this nightly torment, I was at my breaking point. I was barely sleeping, jumping at every shadow, my life reduced to a constant state of low-grade terror. Waiting for the clock to strike 3:13 a.m., I decided I had to destroy it. Last night, I waited in the living room, a heavy sledgehammer in my hands. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with agonizing slowness. At precisely 3:13 a.m., the music box, sitting on the mantel, sprang to life. That horrible, nerve-shredding melody filled the room. As it played, the whispers outside rose to a fever pitch, a chorus of eager, rasping voices pressing in from the darkness. With a scream of desperation and rage, I brought the hammer down. The box shattered into 1,000 splinters of dark wood and twisted brass. The music stopped abruptly. The whispers from the woods fell silent. A profound, beautiful silence filled the house. I stood there, panting, the hammer heavy in my hands. A wave of triumphant relief washed over me. It was over. I had beaten it. I had broken the connection. I stood there for a long time, savoring the quiet. And then I heard it. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. The same discordant tune, starting up again. It wasn't coming from the pile of splinters on the floor. It was coming from inside the walls of the house. From the north wall first, then the south, then the east, then the west. The melody was everywhere, echoing to the very bones of the structure, as if the house itself had learned the song. I finally understood. The box was never the source of the music. It was just the amplifier. And now that I've broken it, I can't turn it off. The song is in the house now, and it's calling something home.